Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Theology Talk. Today we will be talking about the importance of the Abrahamic Covenant and how it cannot be interpreted symbolically or non-literally or allegorically or metaphorically or in any such way that would cancel any parts of the covenant taken in its plain, literal sense. Anyways, so let's get into it. So we'll get into the Abrahamic Covenant with in Genesis, and we'll get into some quotes by the prominent dispensational authors like Louis Chafer, J. Dwight Pentecost, Walvoord, George Peters. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So we're going to start with the Louis Sperry Chafer excerpt from Dispensationalism, the book Dispensationalism. I'll put the citation in the video here. So yeah, if you just want to read through that whole section, it's a great read. It's Chafer gets into the unconditional nature of the covenant and gives his reasonings, and I've highlighted a bunch of texts that are pretty foundational to this idea. So Chafer makes the point that the ratification or the confirmation of the covenant was done by Jehovah alone while Abraham was in a deep sleep. So Abraham could actually do nothing. Chafer then gets into quoting the New Testament perspective on, or the New Testament usage of Abraham and grace and works, and ties it right into the New Testament doctrine. So there's plenty of argumentation as to why and how this covenant should be unconditional, separate from works. Nothing that anyone could do could cancel this covenant. It's clear. Alright, and the next excerpt is from J. Dwight Pentecost in his famous book, Things to Come. It further nails the point home about the unconditional nature of the covenant, the Abrahamic Covenant. Have a look at that too. Here, these little excerpts here, Dwight Pentecost gets into Keelan Delitzsch, some Jewish commentary on the meaning of the covenant, the method of the covenant in Genesis 15. So the next excerpt we'll get into is one from J. Dwight Pentecost in his seminal work, Things to Come. It really provides a good point for the reason why the Abrahamic unconditional covenant should be interpreted literally, because if any covenant stands today, it's because it's interpreted literally. Like, imagine trying to make an agreement with anyone, and when the time comes for the fulfillment of that agreement, whatever agreement it is, what if the person, or what if you just simply said, oh, I thought that this was a non-literal agreement. I thought this tenant or agreement was non-literal. Apply that to anything like work or mortgage or marriage. Like, imagine you could just be able to say, oh, I thought that part was non-literal. It's but this is the way that anti-dispensationalists like to interpret these things. Funnily enough, John Calvin, I've gotten some quotes from him up on the screen here, some excerpts. He interpreted the Abrahamic Covenant much more literally and unconditionally Then later, anti-dispensationalists, he didn't really, dispensationalism wasn't a big thing in his days. More soteriology was his focus. So later on, when dispensationalists started to put forward their arguments, then some more theologians from the Reformed camp started to combat and argue against. So we'll see later quotes, later excerpts from later anti-dispensational covenantal authors that really try to make this Abrahamic covenant of none effect, or that it was canceled. In this specific excerpt from John Calvin, I've really highlighted the John Calvin's ideas on this Abrahamic covenant, and how it's not related to Abraham's works, and how it's nothing can be added to the covenant to make it more unconditional. Now, in the following John Calvin excerpt here, John Calvin defends quite strongly the unconditional nature of the covenant and the Jews breaking the covenant, and that the Jews tried to make this covenant rendered wholly void, but God did not cancel the covenant, and he still punished them according to it. So before I had mentioned that I was going to get into anti-dispensational opinion changing in regards to the Abrahamic Covenant. So let's get into it now. It's going to get into Oswald Alice from his book Prophecy and the Church. And in the book, Alice argues that the basis for the non-literal interpretation and the conditional interpretation of the Abrahamic Covenant is based on an unstated condition that Alice has to admit on content that is not in Scripture. That is to say that the doctrine that the Abrahamic Covenant is conditional is based on no scriptural basis. This is all from J. Dwight Pentecost's book, Things to Come, by the way, and the reference will be put at the end of this section here. So the next excerpt we'll get into from J. Dwight Pentecost is critique of Alice. Actually, he quotes Walvoord here as critique of Alice. Anyways, is Alice's statement that obedience is always a condition of blessing. But interestingly enough, that contradicts Calvinist doctrine. Whereas Alice's doctrine of unconditional election, Walvoord asks. And I'll just give you a little bit to read through this section here, the rest of Walvoord, before I get into my next quote. So the next quote, Alice follows another line of argument. Alice starts to waver when he interprets the covenant as literally and non-literally to suit his fancy, to suit his theological doctrine. He interprets it unconditionally or conditionally, depending on what is needed for his doctrine. An interesting case could be made for the reason why the Bible describes such vile, such, disgusting sin in Judges or, in Israel's history. And that is to show that the grace of God and the unconditional nature of the covenant still stands. And that's exactly what is argued by Walvoord in this excerpt here. Also in Luke chapter 1, verses 32 to 33 and verses 54 to 55, Luke argues that the birth of Jesus is associated with the fulfillment of the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants. That is to say, Jesus fulfills the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants, the unconditional covenants. So Alice does affirm that the New Testament does need the Abrahamic covenant to be intact and unconditional, and still needing fulfillment. But then he also argues that it was conditional and already fulfilled in the time of Solomon and Joshua. So he has an inconsistency here. Anyways, so this next excerpt really hits the point home about the interpretation of the dispensationalists in making the term Israel be consistent and mean exactly what it purports to mean. It's been argued that dispensationalists take an extreme literal view to Scripture, but even some of the non-dispensational authors like Charles Hodge and others have so interpreted the term Israel to mean exactly that, just not the church. Another point that this excerpt really does a good job of is to distinguish between the different parts of the Abrahamic covenant that many do not consider. Like there's the promises to Abraham himself, there's the promises to the nation of Israel, and then there's the universal promises to all families of the earth, all contained in the Abrahamic covenant. It is not denied that the seed of Abraham, so interpreted in the Epistle of Galatians to be the single seed of Christ, through which Jews or non-Jews or saints interpret the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. It's not denied that dispensationalists still interpret the seed in that manner, but the dispensational also considers the national and Gentile salvation blessings in the Abrahamic covenant. A great place to go for this actually is the Schofield Study Bible. Go through the Genesis chapters in relation to Abraham, and it gets into the exegesis of the different parts of the Abrahamic covenant. I'm not going to get into it in this video just because this is a good summary what J. Dwight Pentecost has given, and we don't want to get too stretched for time here. So this last excerpt here really sums up the whole point of what I've been saying, and that is that Alice flip-flops on the conditional and unconditional interpretation of the covenant. It doesn't agree with his own Calvinist theology. Just the last highlight here, I'm going to read off here. The last sentence there. If the security offered under the Abrahamic covenant were conditional, there would be no assurance of salvation. That really shows a big hole in the Calvinist covenantal eschatological theology of amillennialism. Anyways, that's the end of my video here then.